Hey, CNFers, it's that time of year. Is it really still that time of year? I think it is. You're getting on that treadmill. You might be hiring a personal trainer, and you might be a few sessions in to your personal training to reveal that hot body of yours. You know, you're already hot, soft over here, but we're working on that. But maybe your writing needs a boost. Maybe you need a writing personal trainer in your corner. If you're working on a book, an essay, query, book proposal, you name it. If you're ready to level up, email me at brendan@brendanomera.com, hey, and we'll start a dialogue. I'd be honored to help you get where you want to go.
I think one of the biggest things I used to see as a features editor was people pitching, well, a few things, I guess, not even just as a features editor. People pitching ideas or topics, people pitching topics instead of stories.
Ho-ho! Hey, it's the Creative Nonfiction Podcast, a show where I speak to badass people about the art and craft of telling true stories. Did you just leave because you found that annoying? It's okay. It's okay. I'm Brendan O'Mara. How's it going? Hank, who do we have on the show today? Okay. No help at all. Gloria Liu. Ah, nice. Sweet. I like this. I like this one a lot. She's a freelance writer whose work for Outside Magazine is what prompted me to reach out to her, specifically this reported essay she wrote about burnout and finding the meaning of life. My wife actually sent it to me because she and I are both chronically burned out. I read it. I loved it. I cold emailed Gloria and was like, bro, want to talk? And she was like, bro, yeah, let's do it. And then I read more of her work, which is great. And then we fired up the mics. I'll warn you that for the first part of the conversation, there was a weird scratchy sound on Gloria's mic. I had stopped the conversation to have her fix it. Then it kind of came back a little bit, but then it eventually disappears for good. So bear with it or roll with it, or you know, if you don't want to, that's fine. It'll hurt my feelings, of course, but you can stick with it. It's okay. It's worth it. It's worth sticking with it. I want to remind you to keep the conversation going on Twitter at CNFPod or at Creative Nonfiction Podcast on Instagram. You can also support the podcast by becoming a paid member at patreon.com/CNFPod. As they say, the show is free, but it sure as hell ain't cheap. Members get transcript, chances to ask questions of future guests, which nobody is really taking the offer on that. I give you credit for it, but I guess no one really pays attention to the post that I put up there. It's okay. It's there for you when you want to. Drawing up some special podcasts too, some exclusive content for that audience. So if you want a little something extra, consider supporting that, because then you're supporting the show, the audio magazine, and putting some dollars and cents into writers' pockets, because that's what we do. Free ways to support the show, of course. You can leave a kind review on Apple Podcasts or a rating on Spotify, the beleaguered Spotify at this time. Written reviews for our little podcast that could go a real long way towards validating the enterprise for the wayward CNFer. We've stalled out for quite a bit, as I keep saying, and it'd be nice to ramp those up again. So if you have a moment, and it truly only takes a moment, head over to Apple Podcasts or just rate the show. If you can't leave a written review, rating is fine. Very expeditious, as they say. Show notes in my up to 11 monthly newsletter can be found at brendanomera.com. Hey, once a month, no spam, can't beat it. And you can also consider supporting West Virginia Wesleyan College's MFA in creative writing, because they support this show. The support is waning for the show. They're gonna, so think about capitalizing on it while they're still sponsoring the show. It's a low residency MFA in creative writing, in its 11th year. This affordable program boasts a low student to faculty ratio, a strong sense of community. Recent faculty for CNF include Randon Billings Noble, Jeremy Jones, and CNF Pod alum Sarah Einstein. There's also fiction and poetry tracks. Recent faculty there being Ashley Bryan Phillips and Jacinta Townsend, as well as Diane Gilliam and Savannah Sipple. So no matter your discipline, man, if you're looking to up your craft or learn a new one, consider West Virginia Wesleyan right in the heart of Appalachia. Go to mfa.wvwc.edu for more information and dates of enrollment. Speaking of another place to visit, go follow Gloria on Twitter at that's_my_line. Her website is gloria-liu.com, and Liu is spelt Liu. She's the former features editor for Outside Magazine. She edited features for Bicycling and Runner's World, and she's been a Best American Sports Writing Notable 2 times, I believe. I think you'll be inspired by her. I know I was, man. So let's figure out the meaning of life with Gloria Liu.
It's kind of like punk rock long form.
Oh, fuck yeah, it is. Riff.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I like that. I mean, I think in general, freelance journalism is exactly the latter, right? It's a long game where hopefully you get a lot of shots. I think recently I've been in an interesting stage in my short freelancing career, I guess. I just went freelance for the second time maybe 7 months ago. So it was kind of fast and furious in the beginning. You know, you like leave your job. I was working as the features editor at Outside. So if you're going to leave a full-time job and go into freelancing, that's a pretty good one, I think. Yeah, I had a lot of opportunities pretty much right off the bat, which I feel really fortunate about. And then, you know, it was almost like too many at first. I hit this point where I was like, okay, I think I can be a little bit more strategic about things. What ended up happening was I turned down an opportunity that was really amazing. And it was a dream publication, a dream story, and I was too busy to do it. And that really killed me. And it made me kind of pause and say, okay, like, I think it's time to slow down and maybe say no to a few things so that I can, one, like develop the ideas I'm really excited about, and to, yeah, make space to say yes to things that, you know, these kind of serendipitous opportunities that come about. So the last couple of months has been kind of slow. I feel like I haven't been taking a lot of shots, and it's been by design, but it's still pretty, I think it naturally raises an anxiety, like you're not doing enough. Because, you know, the idea generation phase doesn't feel like taking shots. It feels like you're, you know, sort of sitting there just, I don't know, like whatever, like, I don't know what you would even do before taking shots. Like you're just looking at game plans and just trying to work out a game plan even. So I guess it's sort of a long-winded way of just thinking about, yeah, like how good it even feels to be able to take a shot, you know, like, and
right.
Yeah. And I guess that's, I feel like the most exciting time is when you feel like you are taking a lot of shots, you know, even if you don't make all of them or most of them.
Sure, and I think especially early on, as you are trying to get traction and some sort of a toehold in the writing, you know, writing in journalism and so forth, that taking all those shots is really necessary to try to build up your batting average, and then you can really, I think, you might be in this position now, given that it's your second soiree into freelancing, and I can't wait to talk about your first soiree into it. But having been a features editor at Outside, you start having these connections, and you can be a little more, you can fire fewer arrows and probably get closer to the bullseye the more and more experience you get and the more and more people you know. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, man, you just said it so much better than I did in terms of what I feel like I'm trying to do. I feel like I'm trying to take fewer shots, but higher quality ones, and shots that I really feel good about, you know. And it's so funny to use this metaphor because I did play basketball growing up. So I'm like, yeah, like instead of just heaving the ball, you know, at the hoop over and over again, sort of desperately, really like setting up, taking aim, and taking a shot I feel really good about. But yeah, being in a place where you are taking shots, I think that feels really good. And I do feel like I'm starting to get my rhythm in the last month or so, and I am starting to take shots again, and it feels good.
And I love that you brought up, this idea of the idea generation, and a lot of people, it's a lot of fun to sometimes unpack like how you go about ideas. When do they come to you? Where do they come to you? How do you keep track of them? What are the ones that are worth putting your resources in? And when it comes to pre-reporting out a story versus really diving in whole hog. So maybe you can give us a sense of what idea generation is like for you.
Yeah, that's actually, I'm really glad you're asking this. And I guess I'm going to back up a little bit by saying that before our conversation today, I was thinking a little bit of the perspective I might bring today, because I'm going to be the first to say that in terms of my career, it's just, I'm not as established as a lot of the guests that you've had on your show, right? I mean, I was listening to your interview with like Susan Orlean and, Jen Miller, who's been freelancing for, I think she said 17 years. And I guess I'm pretty new to the game relative to those folks. Like I have several years of experience as an editor, but as a journalist and a writer, I am still pretty early on in my career. So I say that because one thing I've really realized these last several months is that idea generation is such a writer's craft. There are things that editors are really good at, and those skills I've really honed, and those muscles are very developed, right, from the last several years. And being a reporter, developing ideas, that's something I'm learning right now. And it's great. And that's exactly why I wanted to become a writer full-time, because I had all these half-baked ideas as an editor. And I always was like, man, if I just had time to like really go down the rabbit hole and like develop a pitch, these could be amazing stories, but I just don't even know because I'm so busy doing my day job. And now I do have that time. And and it's something I'm really learning on the fly. But in terms of what's worked for me so far, I do write a lot of essays. So a lot of times my ideas are just things like questions that I find myself wondering out loud, often mid conversation with a friend over a beer, or when I'm skiing or riding my bike. Those are things I do for fun. Just like, hey, like, I wonder why I know so many people who are really smart people in every other way, and they're just terrible with money, and I'm one of those people. And that became an essay. Or, I wonder why, like when the pandemic began and I was, as we all were doing, like walking around because there was nothing else to do. I was just going on these long walks, and I'd always hated walking. And I was like, wow, look at all of us just walking around all of a sudden. How funny that this really basic elemental human movement is something that we really stopped doing. And we didn't even think about that until we started doing it again because there was nothing else to do. And that became an essay. So I guess like for the essays, it's very much just stuff I just think about. Because I guess my brain works that way, and it's weird, and I overthink everything. And I kind of sometimes joke to my editor that, like, yeah, you guys are just paying me to overthink things. This may seem really obvious to people. So that's how the essay stuff works. And then in terms of the reported features, I guess for me, a lot of the idea generation just comes from things that kind of catch my attention in my world. So I just wrote a feature for Outside Magazine about the affordable housing crisis in ski towns, and that's something that kind of organically came to my attention because I live in Colorado outside of Denver, and on the weekends I ski, I mountain bike, I go to these mountain towns every weekend or every other weekend, and these places are really near and dear to my heart. And I've lived in mountain towns, and when I started seeing local news headlines and Instagram posts from people I knew about people having a hard time finding housing, that obviously interested me right away. And it was just kind of naturally where I found my attention going. And I was, reading all these local news articles, and that became a story eventually.
Well, and there's a distinction too between freelance journalism and freelance writing. And Are you completely on the journalism side, or do you do some writing stuff, some more mercenary work that maybe you don't tweet about, but it's the thing that also kind of helps with income generation, like a lot of what Jen Miller writes about?
Yeah, I do. I guess mostly journalism. I've been fortunate enough to be busy enough with that so far, but I do have, I guess, one client who toes the line a little bit between both. I mean, it's not, yeah, I write for the Red Bulletin, which is Red Bull's magazine. And so they are like a publication, and the editors who work there come from an editorial background, really strong editorial background, great editors, Peter Flax and Nora O'Donnell. But, I guess Red Bull could be, if you like look at how they're classified for awards, they're classified as a trade magazine. So I do work for them as well. Yeah, I guess that kind of maybe toes the line. But no, I so far haven't done a ton of that sort of category of mercenary work, but I'm very much open to it. I mean, I think it's funny. I come from a consulting background, actually. When I graduated from college, I worked in financial valuation for corporate clients. So I think just thinking about making your time worthwhile and billable hours and projects that are profitable and not profitable is very natural to me. And I think a while back when I was thinking about how freelancing was going to work, and obviously listening to other writers say how they make it economically work, that was always kind of a long-term, plan or vision for me. I was like, yeah, I think I'll likely supplement the editorial work with, other types of contract writing as well.
Now, that was something I wanted to bring up, too, because you wrote one time in one piece, I think it might have been the burnout piece, like in a past life, you say I worked in digital marketing and financial services. And I just wanted to get a sense of the path that brought you there, and then eventually the path that broke you out of that and into the journalistic stuff you got into.
When I was a kid, I always loved magazines and books, and it was my dream to be a writer. But, I didn't know anybody in publishing at all. I grew up in the Bay Area of California. My parents are immigrants from Taiwan, and most of their friends are also Taiwanese American immigrants. And, the adults that I saw worked in engineering or healthcare. Yeah, those kinds of professions. And publishing seemed really, really out of reach. So, and my dad was always like, yeah, you could be a writer. You will end up depressed and broke. Which wasn't super encouraging. So I went into business instead. And yeah, out of school, I worked in the financial services industry for 5 years. And it's so funny. I remember like my first week on the job, I was sitting there staring at this Excel spreadsheet, and I just thought to myself, like, oh gosh, like I really screwed up, like this doesn't feel like me. But at the same time, it was a good job that paid me well. And, I was pretty good at it. And I was promoted pretty quickly. And so I think, for several years, just being kind of intellectually challenged like that and feeling like I had career momentum kept me in that business. I just kind of got to a point in my mid to late 20s, and I'm not even really sure if it was like career on way or something else, but I just was like, hey, I want to take a break and reassess things. So I quit my job, and I was like, you know what? I have never really liked my job. What would it be like to do something I really loved every single day? And it was crazy because I didn't even know what the answer to that question was. I was like, let's see, maybe, I don't know, maybe if I do something I love every day, I'll just get bored of it, So what I really loved at the time was snowboarding. So I ended up going over to New Zealand, actually, and doing a ski season out there. Worked as a lift operator on the mountain, ended up coming back from there and moving to Colorado to work in Aspen at a restaurant, keep skiing and snowboarding. Yeah, when I finished doing that and wanted to go back to the workforce, I went into marketing for a company that served endurance athletes because I was really into cycling at the time. And fortunately for me, that job was somewhat related to publishing in the sense that I was in charge of managing their blog and we were doing content marketing. So I did get a little bit of editing experience there and just experience doing things like planning out a publishing calendar. And yeah, but it was still kind of like, I was like, well, this is pretty good, but that like thought, like dream was always kind of still in the back of my mind. Like, yeah, I wanted to be a writer. I always wanted to be a writer. So one day, I remember I was, kind of sitting there complaining about my job to a coworker through GChat, and he just sent me this job posting, and it was in a junior editor position at Outside Magazine. And I was like, what the heck, I'll go ahead and apply. And I had like no experience, of course, in editorial. So I'm like laughing about this now because it's so funny. And I was like, I have to get their attention somehow. So I put together a PowerPoint presentation about myself with all these like funny photos and jokes. And I like actually got an edit test, and I didn't get the job because, I must not have done very well on my edit test. But one of the best pieces of advice someone ever asked me or someone ever told me was, hey, if you don't get a job, always ask them what you could have done better. So when the editor got back and said, sorry, we're not moving you on, I said, oh, like, can you give me any advice on anything I can do in the next couple of years to be a stronger candidate? And he said, oh, well, thanks for asking. I would love to give that to you. Give me just some time to type up an email. And I was living in Boulder at the time. And I was like, I just remember getting this wild hair and like looking up Santa Fe, which is where Outside is based, and seeing it was 6 hours away. And I was like, why don't I save you that 15 minutes? And I'll just drive out and I'll buy you a beer. You can tell me in person. And
Nice.
He was like, okay, weirdo. But he actually took the meeting, and I ended up going down and meeting with a few of the editors at Outside. And we had like a really nice time. I remember thinking like, wow, these are some of the most interesting, coolest people I've ever met in my life. And I want to do what they do. And I still didn't get the job, Brendan. but I was like, they didn't laugh me out of the room. Maybe I could do this, So I quit my marketing job and I became a freelance journalist.
And this was that for the first soiree into it?
Yes. And it was hard because, again, I didn't have any experience. But what worked out for me was that Outside, because I made those contacts, was kind enough to extend my first few freelance assignments. So yeah, I got some online stories with them, which obviously is really helpful as a budding freelancer. Yeah, and I sort of muddled through my first year of freelancing, figuring it out, getting some small assignments here and there. And I ended up pitching a story to Bicycling Magazine, who I hadn't worked for before. And they told me, hey, we have a job opening as a gear editor. You should apply. And, I didn't think I was qualified at all, but I was like, last time I applied to a job, I got a new client out of it. So why don't I just apply again? And I ended up getting the job. And that was where I really got my initial training as a journalist. I worked at Bicycling for 4 years, and I was there when they got acquired by Hearst, and it became a group that's, now Bicycling, Runner's World, and Popular Mechanics. And yeah, those were the folks who really taught me everything about magazine making and journalism. And I'm really, really grateful to them for extending me that opportunity in the first place.
What were some of your growing pains as you were getting your feet under you in this new industry?
Oh my gosh, there were so many. So I remember my first week on the job at Bicycling, I went to a production meeting, and those are the weekly meetings that they do at magazines to just go through, hey, how's the magazine doing? And, go through all the different stories. And there were all these acronyms, and I remember seeing the acronym CE, and I was like, what does that mean? And now, of course, I know that means copy edit, but I mean, and I was sitting in that meeting, I was like, oh my gosh, I've really never done this before. And it was really bewildering. Yeah. And, I didn't study English or literature or journalism in school. I studied business. And so I had to be taught certain things. I remember my top editor at the time, he's a really wonderful editor. His name is Lou Mazzanti. And I was editing gear reviews, and he was top editing them. I guess I kept using gerunds. And one day he got so fed up, he was like, stop using these gerunds, ! And I was like, I had to Google what a gerund was. Right. I was like, what's he talking about? So it was a lot of really silly little things like that. But again, the editors there were so kind, and yeah, they really mentored me. And I remember my first week on the job, the editor-in-chief at the time, Bill Strickland, who now directs that whole group for Hearst, he said to me, I'm not worried at all about the fact that you don't have any journalism experience. You have such a passion for bikes, and you're clearly smart and know how to manage, workflows and processes. And yeah, I'm not worried about this at all. And that was really kind of him. And yeah, and another editor who was really formative in my development there was Leah Flickinger, who's now the features director for that whole group. And she was the one who taught me, so much of what I know, like how to edit a feature. She used to give me some of her old drafts that, so I could see what the first draft was and see all the different revisions that she had done. So yeah, it was, and I was like really hungry for that stuff too. I was kind of like a little sponge for it. So.
Well, it's amazing to see that, because even super talented, competent, brilliant writers and reporters, they'll turn in a draft and it'll just get shredded by a good editor. And I'm sure you've experienced it on both ends. So what was that like for you to see what a real professional magazine edit partook?
Yeah, that was really eye-opening too, and honestly, where I really saw it the most was when I was this junior editor. We have I don't know if everybody knows what a top edit is, but basically most stories, especially that go into a magazine, will get edited by, your editor, and then it goes to what's called a top edit, which is a second round. And that was really where I learned a lot. And, speaking of growing pains, I'll never forget this. I was in charge of editing our buyer's guide, which is a special issue that Bicycling puts out every year. And it's a huge job. I was the gear editor at the time, and it kind of felt very much like my responsibility. And I was supposed to edit the original plan was I was going to edit every single review that went into the magazine. And we hit a point where it was 2 weeks to ship or something. And, frankly, I was kind of doing them very quickly and passing them on to my top editor, who was Leah. And I'll never forget, it was 6 p.m. or something, or 7 p.m. And she had been kicking them back to me with just really tearing them up. And I was annoyed, and I was like, oh, she's being so picky, and she comes into my office and she goes, I can really tell that you're just kind of passing these through, and you need to take more care with these, basically was the gist of what she said. And I was I think I kind of was I sort of snapped, and I was like, yeah, we don't have time. I'm doing this all by myself, et cetera, whatever excuses. And I'll never forget, she was like, well, I don't know what to say. These just need to be better. And she just left. And I was so speechless. And tears came to my eyes, because I just, I was so frustrated. But then I was like, oh, fine. And I went through and I was, actually putting in the changes that she was suggesting. And lo and behold, it was so much better. The pieces were coming out better. And I guess my big lesson from that was, listen to your editor. And usually when people are giving you feedback and telling you something doesn't work, you may not, the solution may not be exactly what they suggest, but what you're doing isn't working. And you need to try to do better. So yeah, that was really formative for me. And, and I hope that doesn't, make Leah sound bad. I think she was, that was a really valuable lesson she taught me, and she's truly an amazing editor. So, and I guess it really taught me to be, just to hold myself to really high standards in everything I produce.
And when it comes to pitching, you've been on both sides of it. What are some things when people are pitching they're ultimately kind of getting wrong, that's not getting them across the goal line?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the biggest things I used to see as a features editor was people pitching, well, a few things, I guess, not even just as a features editor, people pitching ideas or topics, people pitching topics instead of stories. Someone saying, for example, I want to do a story about the overcrowding on our public camping grounds. And that's a topic, it's not really a story. I think that's something we see a lot. I think another common mistake is, something that doesn't really answer the question of why now? Like, why is this story? Why should we do this now? And I think the last thing is really less of a mistake and more of, I think, like a good check for most people who are pitching is like, if you have written up a pitch, like, do you have a good online head for this story? A good, catchy online head that like you would click on. I don't mean to say like a clickbait head. I just mean like a head that really sums up what the main sell of the story is. And if you don't have that, it probably needs to be honed and focused more.
Sometimes what I think is a really good exercise in distilling what a story is about into a sentence or two. It will really hone and focus the reporting and the research as well. Is can you fit what the story is about into like a tweet, or study Netflix descriptions of movies? Like, some of them are terrible and sometimes don't really sum up the movie, but they are about 1 or 2 sentences long, and they do try to describe an entire feature in a sentence or two. And it's like, okay, you kind of have to get to that point, and then the tip of the spear is very sharp at that point.
Yeah, that's so interesting about the Netflix movie descriptions. I'll have to check them out. But I totally agree. I mean, it's funny because I actually almost start with the head, if that makes sense. Like, that's when I know I have a story idea, is because like a lot of stuff I'm kind of kicking it around, right? And like I'm like talking about it. But the moment I have my head, I know like, okay, this is something I can pitch. And a lot of times, like when I'm writing a pitch, I write the head first, and then the rest of the pitch is written towards that main sell.
When you were putting together this piece that you this burnout piece that you wrote for Outside Magazine, so what was the online head that came to you as you were thinking about this one?
Well, it's funny because it's the actual head that they ended up using in the story, which was, it's easy to find work-life balance. Just find the meaning of life. Yeah. And it was obviously a little tongue-in-cheek, but that was an interesting one because that was an assignment, actually. That wasn't an idea I came up with on my own. Outside wanted to do a package about work-life balance, and they asked me if I could write a lead essay about the topic. And it was really challenging because this is obviously a topic that a lot of really smart writers have written about a lot in the past couple of years. And I was like, what am I going to say that's going to be different or new on this topic, right? That really smart people haven't already said. And then when I was thinking about that, I was like, what is my head going to be that I'm basically writing to? What is this like new thing that I'm going to say? And I was like, the way I was thinking about it was, what is my head? And then when I got to that, I was like, okay, this is the story of what I'm writing to.
Yeah. And you write too in that piece that, that burnout, it really comes from, especially in this country, that it's constant hustle. You got to work so much, and it just doesn't afford you much except really just burning the candle at both ends. You might make some money, but then you have nothing in the tank to enjoy anything it is that the money might be able to afford. And then you, as a result, sort of draw inwards and kind of, in a sense, become just very selfish and myopic because all you have energy for is to kind of just veg out. So, what was, in light of that, like, what was very eye-opening for you over the course of your research of this piece?
I felt like a lot of the discussion I'd heard about burnout and just work-life balance in general put a lot of the onus on the individual, so on the worker, and almost as if like it's your problem, like you work too much, you're a workaholic, you prioritize work too much. And I just I think we all know that's not the case. It's not your fault that your work culture rewards people for working nights and weekends, or that you work in an industry that, is constantly cutting headcount and asking people to do more. That's not our fault. And at the same time, I knew that the article or the piece should be helpful to people and not just, say, hey, look at these systemic problems. Dang it, there's nothing we can do about it. So like striking that balance between those two things, like acknowledging that these are systemic and cultural problems while also giving people something that could make them feel like they had agency. That was really a challenge with this piece. And, you know, in terms of what was eye-opening, yeah, like as the more reading I did and talking to experts, it really affirmed that, like, no, this isn't an individual choice. Like, yes, we do make individual choices to work more and work harder and prioritize work in our lives, but ultimately, you know, it's a result of the culture and the system that we live in. So yeah, just it was really challenging figuring out how to balance the realities, like both of these realities.
And I remember a retail job I had a few years ago, and it goes to a point of from someone you quoted in this piece where, here's the quote. It's like, it could be as simple as not bragging about your own long hours or blocking out your weekends for rest and recovery, and it certainly means being supportive of coworkers who pursue those boundaries too. And I remember when I would occasionally, I don't know, ask for and get a weekend off, you know, a lot of people in the store would just be like, "Oh, must be nice," and they were like constantly like shame you if you you know got a Saturday off or got time off, or you know, if you saved up a few bucks and you went to a concert and everyone was just like, "Whoa, geez, I wish I could do that." And it's like, well, I don't know what to tell you. It's it really felt, especially with the time thing, like, oh, it must be nice, or you're taking a few days off and they make you feel like shit for doing it. It's like, that doesn't help anyone, and you're making me feel guilty for taking some time away. Like, you do it too. Anyone can. You just got to prioritize it.
Right. Yeah, that's very true. Like, there's an aspect of personal choice to that. And then there's like situations in which people can't choose to do that too. And yeah, like if you know, in certain lines of work, there really isn't a lot of flexibility, you know, a lot of low wage work or shift work, a lot of work performed by, you know, typically performed by immigrants or people who may have other reasons that they feel like they don't have as much agency. And I wanted to acknowledge that too. But at the same time, a lot of us do have that agency. So I knew that like the piece couldn't speak to everybody, but I did want to try to paint, I guess, a more full picture than maybe some of the other pieces about work-life balance have maybe done, because I feel like a lot of the stuff I was reading was really geared towards, you know, like white-collar workers or people with desk jobs. And I just wanted to at least, you know, acknowledge that isn't always the reality for everybody, which was why I decided to interview a woman named Sophia Flores, who she works in behavioral health in Mono County, which is where Mammoth Mountain is. And yeah, she talked about how when her parents immigrated from Mexico, they didn't really have a choice. They, you know, had to support the family, and they worked as cleaners, and they worked 7 days a week. And certainly they didn't have the flexibility that she now enjoys. But because of that, you know, she really appreciates the fact that she can like take off at 5 p.m. and go for a trail run or take her dogs for a walk in the middle of the day. Her story, I felt like, encapsulated both sides of that experience.
Yeah, and you end the piece by, you know, speaking with one of your friends, your friend Kat, I believe, and you had asked her, you know, sort of point blank, you know, what the meaning of life is, you know, and what did you take away from that?
Oh my gosh, I loved her answer. So she said, the meaning of life is to live it. And I really was surprised, honestly, by that answer. I thought she would say something like, yeah, and for people who haven't read the story, obviously, so the backstory is that my friend Kat is really a remarkable human being. But one of the things that she recently went through is that she survived ovarian cancer, and she went through chemo and, you know, was going through all that while she was running her own company, a podcast incubator in Denver. And so naturally I thought, wow, like here's somebody who, you know, knows a lot about life and also knows a lot about how important work can be in life. And I just really wanted to get her perspective on it. And I thought she was going to say something like, oh, the meaning of life is to like do good for others or something like that, you know? But the meaning of life is to live it. I like couldn't have asked for a more perfect response, you know? And when I thought about it, I was like, yeah, what else would be the meaning of life?
Right.
It was just, yeah, it was really profound. It felt really right. And I've thought about that quote a lot, just since she said it to me. And it's been like a really good guiding force for me in terms of just like making all sorts of decisions, whether I shut down work for the day or should I sign up for this crazy ski race, even though I've never done a ski race, or, should we plan this trip to Europe this summer, like, because we haven't traveled internationally for literally years, and it's like, well, what is the meaning of life? Like, live life, live it.
And I like in the pieces that I've read from you, whether it's does your bicycle have a soul, or the awesome piece you wrote on garages, which I really really love that one, and or the young people being bad with money. They're all like reported first person driven stories. So, how did you develop your taste where that's kind of a groove you've really locked into?
Honestly, it kind of happened by accident. It's funny because when I first started working in journalism, I actually was a little self-conscious about writing about myself. And it's actually because I got that feedback pretty early on. I was writing a few pieces for Bicycling Magazine, and one of the pieces of feedback I got from one of my editors was, you need to learn to like think more about the reader and what the reader is going to get out of this, like, and this wasn't direct feedback, but, I would hear about writers who could only write about themselves. And I was like really afraid of becoming a writer like that. Because, I think essay is a really natural form for a lot of people. And it's like the easiest form, right? Like all the material lives inside your head. Social media, like we all write first person, everyone does it. So I was like almost afraid of being somebody who could only write in first person or only write about myself. So I really like almost forced myself not to write about myself for my first few years. And so it's really only in the last, I would say, 2 to 3 years that I've really felt comfortable writing essay again. And I think that almost like aversion to it the first 4 years or so actually probably helped me become a better essay writer, because like really at their heart, my essays aren't about me, right? Like,
right.
And of course that's like the most basic writing thing. The most basic writing tip is that your writing's never really about you. It just kind of like naturally, those were the ideas that I naturally started to have. And what I found like made them much more interesting and rich was, the reporting that I could do around them. So the ideas always came from my life or my head, but then, the bulk of the information that I think is really interesting to people is always the reporting.
Yeah, that definitely imbues the first person part, which is more you're just kind of a conduit or a stand-in for the reader, and you're like, I'm your guide, I'm going to hold your hand through this, these are the questions that I'm positing that I'm hoping that will resonate with you, and here's all the research I did to back this, but you're going to come on my tandem bicycle here, I'm going to pedal, you're going on for this ride.
yeah exactly. And I think maybe one other reason that this may have become kind of the bulk of my work so far is that when I was working as an editor, I didn't, again, like I said earlier, I didn't have as much time to chase down maybe story ideas that would take more reporting. So essays were easier to write when I was, doing all my writing on weekends and early mornings and evenings. So that might also be why quite a bit of my work from the last couple of years has been essay writing. But, I will say too that I definitely want to move more towards like reported narratives. I find them really interesting and really fun to write. And and a lot of times I want to take a break from talking about myself because I'm really not that interesting. Yeah.
Who are some of the reporters doing that long form, narratively driven feature writing that you're really drawn to and you'd like to emulate the most?
Oh my gosh, I'm so glad you asked. I was actually thinking about this earlier. Well, there are two Rachels, Rachel Monroe, Rachel Aviv. And yeah, Rachel Aviv is, obviously a staff writer at the New Yorker, and Rachel Monroe does a lot of really amazing freelance.
Rachel Monroe's a staff writer at New Yorker now.
Oh, she is. I missed that.
Yeah,
okay,
it just happened a couple months ago. She's been on this podcast. I've tried to get the other Rachel, Rachel Aviv, on to working on that. That'll happen at some point. But yeah, Rachel Monroe. She just got that as she's got the little cute Avatar, New Yorker Avatar cartoon.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, of course. Well, good for them. Yeah, I just feel like they're both writers who just write, like, they do both the reporting and the writing just so well. And they write with such discipline. I don't know, like, yeah, it's such like restraint and discipline. And yet, they're just, when I see that byline, I'm just like, okay, this is going to be good. So when I was working at Bicycling, Steve Friedman was doing a lot of long form features for Bicycling and Runner's World. And I really admire his work. He's somebody who I feel like, he's obviously written for some big publications, but he's also just done really well. It seems like he just writes stories about topics that really interest him, right? Like he's done a lot of sports writing, and he writes for these smaller publications, and he just absolutely kills it. And, his writing's always in Best American Sports Writing, National Magazine Award nominations. And yeah, he just does such a great job with profiles and with characters. From outside, was always a big fan of Tim Cahill. He's just really funny.
Yeah.
He writes really funny adventure narratives, and I really admire people who can write humorously, because I don't know. I just feel like it seems like one of the few things that, obviously I think you can get better at everything in writing, but you kind of you're either a funny writer or you're not really that funny, and I would love to be funny, but yeah. And then Nick Baumgarten, another New Yorker writer. I guess I really have kind of a little bit of a New Yorker bias maybe, but he obviously covers a lot of the topics that I'm interested in the outdoors, and he's also a pretty funny writer. So yeah.
Yeah, I love his profiles, and I'm drawn to sports writing and sports profiles, and he does them exceptionally well. They're always a great read.
That being said, I feel like there's so many writers I admire. Like we could go on and on. Those are the names that I feel like I see repeatedly, and I'm like, look for their work.
Now, you said something really interesting regarding both Rachels about restraint, and what does that look like to you, and as you're reading it, and maybe as you're trying to maybe execute it in your own writing?
Yeah, I think actually what I was referring to was really kind of emotional restraint.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, like all good journalism, obviously we're always striving to report the truth, right? And just report the facts and what happened. But, especially stories that deal with really difficult subjects, like some of the ones that Rachel Monroe and Rachel Aviv have written about. I just really admire when people can write about them in a way that isn't sensational and is like respectful of everybody in the story, and is fair. And I don't know, it's maybe a little bit hard to articulate, but yeah, it's just the way that they describe sometimes things that some people that you could be tempted to just go over the top on.
Right.
But you can feel that like kind of professional restraint, and yeah, I really admire that quality.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about, because there are certain topics that can be, it's very easy to sensationalize and go into, I don't know, for lack of a better term, like gory language. Whereas if you just kind of, like you said, exercise that restraint and turn down the volume on the writing, that way the scene and the reporting itself will really sort of rise out of it. If you just show, okay, I'm going to put a restrictor plate on this and just let the story bubble up to the top. It doesn't need any more flourishes by the writer.
Yeah. You like when you read a piece, and you're just like, wow, there wasn't a single statement, it feels like there wasn't a single line in here that wasn't just a statement of fact or, a quote from someone, and there wasn't a single line in here that was a statement of opinion or editorializing. And yet it makes this story altogether says something really powerful. I'm like, wow, that's masterful. Yeah, I remember actually, speaking of Rachel Aviv, the piece of hers that really did that, where she did really well, was about Elizabeth Loftus. She was a psychologist who studied, the way that memories are formed and how memory can be faulty. And obviously, legally sensitive piece. So you have to sort of, just present the facts. But she did it really, really well there.
Now, given that you're in your your second rodeo with freelancing, what's your relationship to ambition right now, and where you want to take it?
Oh, great question. I sometimes feel like all I am is ambition, and I don't know if that's it's a little dramatic, but I feel on the topic of work-life balance, sometimes I think I have no work-life balance, or I need more work-life balance, because I just think about work all the time. I think about my career all the time and stories I want to work on. And yeah, I'm just always thinking about stories and writing. And yeah, sometimes I'm like, wow, this is really intense, and I'm probably not very much fun to be around right now, unless you also just want to talk about stories and writing or what's happening in the news, or, but I think that's also okay. I kind of believe in seasons in life. I think we have seasons to play, when your job should just be a paycheck and you just clock in and out, and then otherwise you do what you love, and have fun, and seasons to work. And I feel like I'm very actively still in the trying to make it part of my freelance career. And so it's okay if, I am 80% to 90% ambition right now, and 10 to 20% chill and fun. So yeah, I guess I feel very ambitious and very ready to, really do what it takes to get established. And I'm sure that will I hope it'll even out a little bit more in the future. But yeah, work and writing is definitely basically number one priority right now.
How would you define, in this season of your life, how would you define what making it is?
It's funny, because I think I remember maybe a year ago, somebody asked me, when I was saying I was thinking about going freelance, they said, oh, what are your dream publications? And it's funny, because at the time, and I really meant it, I was like, I've never really thought about it that way. I think more about dream stories, dream work I'd like to do. And I've thought more just about, I want to do these types of stories, or stories that make people feel a lot, or really, or just really, really good work. And then I, quit my job and I started freelancing. And then the last few months of last year, I was really okay, there are these publications I really want to break into. And I think I want to be that kind of writer who writes for this publication. I think I'm coming back around to no, I think I just want to do I just want to do really, really good work, work that I'm really proud of. And I think that's going to lead to, somewhere good, where I can be hey, I feel really good about my career, and I'm, if I haven't made it, I have arrived at least at a place where I'm doing it. And yeah, I'm trying to just come back to that original intent, which is I want to do work I'm really proud of, which I know sounds kind of banal, but the reality is actually, I think if you ask most people, what have you produced that you're really, really proud of? The list, I think, is really short for most people, For me, I think it's two stories out of, I think, a lot that I've written. And yeah, to write a story you're really, really proud of is actually a huge achievement. Yeah. And I guess to have really made it, it's to be consistently producing work that I'm really, really proud of.
What are those two stories you're really proud of right now?
I'm proud of the housing story that I wrote for Outside.
And you said
Because
that just came out, right?
yeah, that came out in November. It was a story about the affordable housing crisis in mountain towns. And it was, I'm proud of it because it sounds like a really dry topic. I know, probably like people are hearing this and like snore, but I promise the story isn't dry. At least I don't think it's dry. It ended up being a story really about a town called Crested Butte, Colorado, which was grappling with this problem, as many ski towns all over the West are. But I ended up speaking and spending time with a guy there named Will Desjardins, and he was a town councilman, and he really, really fought for affordable housing. And it was a lot about his like fight and the challenges he came up against, and like how frustrating and exhausting and maybe in the end like disillusioning it was, and just kind of, I don't know, to me it felt like a story about normal people trying to fight like really big systemic forces, that sometimes feel like, there's like inevitable, right? Like, yeah, so I'm proud of that one. And it took a lot of reporting, and I'm proud of that too. And the other piece is my story about finance. And I think for that one, it's like, it's less so that I'm like proud necessarily of, it's not like the writing or anything, but it like seemed like it really resonated with a lot of people. And it was a story that scared me a lot. Like I remember, I was so scared that I almost considered, and I never told anybody this, but I almost considered telling them not to run it online because I was so scared. I thought there was going to be this huge backlash, and I was like bracing myself for hate mail when it came out online. And instead it was the opposite of that. It was like a lot of people messaging to say like, hey, this really resonated with me. Thank you for writing this.
Yeah, that was a great piece. And it was, I could, and hearing you talk about it and the way you write about a certain part at the end where you're like, this is the part where I'm almost, I'm afraid to admit that I received a certain degree of help from my parents, in acknowledging that sort of monetary privilege that a lot of people don't have. And I could sense the discomfort of you writing it, and which you hat tipped to that discomfort, and like hearing you talk about the backlash that you're afraid that you might receive. So I can feel that energy, that pulse.
Yeah. I like thought I was, I don't know. And I guess, and that's like the point of the piece, right? Mm-hmm. Like that shame is actually the entire point of the essay, is that we feel so much shame, like the psychologist Brad Klontz that I quoted, like we feel so much shame around money. We feel shame when we have too little, and we feel shame when we have too much, like to be like in your 30s and say like, hey, I had to get help from my parents to buy a house. Like that feels really shameful. And I thought people were going to write me and be like, oh, boohoo, like must be nice, having parents to help you out. Like I thought I was going to get letters like that. Yeah. But instead, like, yeah, I heard from people who were like, yeah, I'm not fortunate enough to have that, but still this part of the article resonated with me. And I think even just like saying like, hey, I couldn't do this without outside help says so much about our current moment and the challenges facing like our generation, right? Like it is hard. It's hard to buy a house. And
oh yeah,
these days. And most people, can't do it without help. So.
Yeah, well, in this country, we're very obsessed with like the rags to riches story of self-made man did it by himself or herself, but then like your piece also gets to like, even if you do make it, even if you come from nothing and you do make it, then there's still shame that you've made it. It's like it's this weird. Like what a catch-22 of bullshit about around money. Like what a horrible story that we have to tell ourselves about money. It's really so hard.
Yeah, and it's like crazy. Once you start to say it out loud, you like see how you're like, wait, this is crazy, Yeah. But yeah, until you do, I guess I took it for granted, right? Like, and I was like, oh, I'm the only person who feels this way. I mean, of course I knew I wasn't the only person, but I was like, yeah, like most people like wouldn't understand this. I'm never going to say this out loud, that I like feel kind of ashamed that I grew up economically comfortable, and it's not even that interesting of a thing to say. But like one thing I've thought a lot about writing recently, and writing essay, I guess, is like you have to have a lot of faith that the experiences that make you feel like a weirdo are actually really universal.
Right.
You know, like
yeah.
your like most bizarre, weird thoughts, like actually a lot of people think them, but you have to have faith. So then like at the same time, while you're sitting there thinking you're a total alien, you also have to believe that everyone's a little bit like you. It's so weird.
Yeah. What was a lesson that, or a best lesson that you learned from having studied business that you've applied to your freelance writing?
I think very naturally about like the business side of things. So when I was a consultant, I had to track all my billable hours and we would bill them to the client. And I had a rate, you know, I think I billed out at like, by the time I left, $525 an hour, which is pretty crazy. Mm-hmm. And, you know, my boss had a rate, and the people who, you know, like the junior people had a rate. Everybody had different rates. So it's very intuitive for me to think about my time as being worth some dollar amount, right? And so when I think about kind of like the business aspect of it and like, you know, fees, it's really natural for me to be like, okay, how much time do I think this story is going to take? What is the fee? Does this, at least from a financial perspective, make sense? That's been really helpful because, you know, that's like one of the bars that you want an assignment to clear, right? So that's helpful for me. And then I think the other thing is, you know, having a financial analysis background actually is proving to be pretty helpful when I'm reporting out stories like the affordable housing story, where you're like looking at this really complicated problem that has a lot of different variables and inputs, and you're trying to like translate something that could be really dry and boring and complicated to, you know, a mainstream audience, or a layperson. And, you know, like, and there's a lot of numbers that you could look at, and like, how do you relate them to one another in a way that tells a story and makes sense? And how do you correctly interpret data and trends, what's relevant, what's not? And I think it's like really natural for me to think about those things. I'm actually working on a story right now where I'll actually be putting some more financial analysis skills to work. And it's really fun. It's fun to have that skill set and be like, oh, wow, it's like showing up in a surprising way in my line of work as a journalist.
Nice. Well, Gloria, as I primed the pump a little while ago before we were officially on mics, I always like to ask guests as we bring this airliner down for a landing for a recommendation of any kind, and I extend that to you. What as we wind down our wonderful conversation, you know, what would you recommend for the listeners out there?
Oh, this is for the listeners. I thought it was for you.
Oh shit! You can give one. You can give one to me too. What would you recommend for me, Gloria?
Well, sorry. Well, yeah. Why not? Let's turn this one on its head a little bit.
Wow. I'm so sorry that's how you read it. 'Cause what a weird thing to ask. To be like, all right, at the end of the show, Gloria, I ask guests all the time, I need a recommendation. So.
Well, I don't know. That's such a funny, what a strange interpretation now that I think about it. Of course you mean for the reader or the listener. But let's just go with this. So I guess I'll start with a question. Do you ever interview editors on the podcast?
I have. I'm drawing a blank. But actually, you know, I interview. So I do this thing with the Atavist magazine where I interview their monthly writer every single month, and I routinely also interview Jonah Ogles and Sayward Darby.
Cool.
Mm-hmm. Of them, so we get a little espresso shot of what it's been like, mainly to edit that piece, and then a few things that come to mind, and as some other people that primarily edit. I've drawn a blank. I've done nearly 300 of these, so there are some editor types in there, but yeah, I'm always game for more of those. That's for sure.
Okay, cool. Well, I was just going to generally say, I would recommend interviewing somebody who's still, you know, actively editing and does that full time. And I feel like editors just never get the recognition they're due. And I guess if you're a really good editor, I guess that's what makes a really good editor, is that you're like okay with being the support, right? Like you do all this amazing stuff in the background and you never really get any credit for it. So that's one thing. But two, I also feel like I just love to hear longtime magazine editors, or like, yeah, especially features editors, like talk about the craft of like structure for a story, and helping writers with, get through hard points in their story, and like how sometimes it's almost like, you'll hear editors say like, oh, it's almost like being a therapist, right? Like, I love hearing longtime editors talk. They're such like generally like kind, magnanimous people. And so I guess, yeah. And if you're looking for somebody in particular to speak to, I'd love to recommend reaching out to my old mentor, Leah Flickinger, over at Bicycling and Runner's World and Popular Mechanics. She's done some really amazing work. She worked on the Runner's World piece that Mitch Jackson wrote about Ahmaud Arbery, 12 Minutes in a Life, which I guess that's my recommendation for readers. That's an amazing story. Have you read it?
I have a little while. It's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. She's just so good at what she does. So I guess that's my recommendation to you and to the readers. I would say they should read that story. It's really, really powerful.
Nice. And I desperately want to interview Daniel Zaleski, who he edits Patrick Radden Keefe, David Gran, a bunch of people at the New Yorker, and he's an amazing writer and reporter himself. Like his profile of Guillermo del Toro from a few years ago was just awesome. But he's just like the silent conductor behind so many of these rock stars that we know in the New Yorker. And so I was like, I desperately want to talk to him too, and just to pick his brain about the very things that you're saying about how the structure decisions, maybe just a little sort of like, okay, just keep going. Like, and that's all you need to like. Dick Todd, who used to edit, the late Dick Todd, who used to edit Tracy Kidder's books, like so often he would just be like, okay, just keep going, very good, keep going, and that was it. So it's like sometimes very subtle hand.
Yeah, like, oh man, I love it when an editor will just like cross out one line, and it's usually the last one that you thought was your like most amazing last line, and then you're like, wait, this is so much better. It's the opposite of keep going. It's like, okay, no, stop here.
Fantastic. Well, Gloria, thank you so much for carving out the time to come on the show and talk a little shop. This was a lot of fun, and I can't wait to read what you come up with next. So thank you for the time, and thank you for the work.
Thank you so much for having me. This was really fun, Brendan.
Oh boy. Oh boy. Oh boy. Oh boy. Man, I dug that. I hope you did too. That was funny that she thought the recommendation I was asking for was for me. But in Gloria's defense, before we were recording, well, actually we were recording, but I had the thing recording and I cut out a whole bunch before I actually like start the show. So a little inside baseball there. But I had asked her, because I forgot to prime the pump. I usually prime the pump by emailing them like, hey, I like to ask guess a recommendation for the listeners at the end of the show. It's kind of a fun way to bring the airliner down. You hear me say it. So I asked her for that recommendation, but I just didn't say for the listeners. So I assumed, and you know what assuming gets you. And so because I didn't say that, she just thought she was a really good sport about it. She was like, oh, cool, I already know what I'm going to recommend. I was like, awesome, this is cool. I can't wait till we get there. And then she thought it was for me, and it made for some funny tape, didn't it? Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast wherever you podcast, so you get that little notification on CNF Friday and the rando time that the Atavist one drops. It'll hit your feed, and you'll be like, shit, let's do this. How I know what I'm going to do, when I'm washing my dishes or I'm walking my dog. Yeah. Consider leaving a rating or review if you're not too annoyed by me and what it is I stand for, whatever that happens to be. These were reviews of sorts. They mean the world and help validate the enterprise. Of course, feel free to share and link up to the show on social media. Being sure to tag the show at CNF Pod so I can give you that digital fist bump. So for randomly, I just started kind of rewatching some Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee again, and I love how tight the shows are. They're very efficient. Yeah, of course, they're mildly irritating at times, but I love the rigor of the editing. Like, I watch it for the editing, and it got me thinking of how I can make this show a bit more like that. So when they film that show, they're spending an entire day with, Bridget Everett or whoever, and then they cut that show down to 15 minutes. It's incredible. And I guess they in the edit, they probably just are ruthless and just be like, well, cut all the dull stuff. But it's something that's already have a conversation with someone. You don't want to insult them. But in any course of a conversation, there are lags. And I guess if you really need to get rigorous, it's like you just got to compare relative to other spots in the conversation. If there's a lag, you got to cut the lag. Or if there's a good nugget in the lag, I guess you just narrate it. Anyway, so it got me thinking about what that would look like for audio only. And I figured in the whole punk rock metal ethos of the show, bridging certain things with the heavy metal music, maybe some narration, and then maybe just a quick, I pop in for a quick question or narration and let the guest speak and then have another little interlude. I don't know. I might dig up some of the tape from my masters and toy around with taking, say, the conversation with Laura Hillenbrand, futzing around with maybe the best 15 minutes of that hour-plus conversation. I mean, that one was so damn good. So finding only 15 minutes will be a struggle, but it might be a fun exercise. And I figure I'll just drop that for the Patreon audience for a test run. So you can consider if you want more of that content and it actually resonates, and I think it will. I think it could be fun. That's extra incentive to get that exclusive thing over at Patreon. You can pick a tier and go shop around. I imagine some of you enjoy the current format and its current length of the show, but an interview show is kind of bland in its form. And this interview you just listened to was number 300. So should I continue with the same formula? I don't know. You can always ping me on social or email me with thoughts or just any thoughts in general. I reply to people. I don't get that much email. Anyway, stay wild, CNFers. Here's to 300. I guess here's to the next 300, right? Because one thing's for sure, over the last nearly 10 years I've been doing this, if you can't do, interview. See ya.